सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Welcome to this unconventional episode of Cut The Clutter. Remember, I said unconventional, not unusual. That's an expression I might use for episodes of Cut The Clutter several times, quite often, but unconventional, rarely. So this is unconventional in the sense that this is a mix of facts, analysis, and opinion thrown in every now and then. That's also because we are talking about the state of the world, as Prime Minister Narendra Modi goes through these very important meetings in Washington, D.C. Probably, in fact, most certainly, his most important foreign visit, the most important part of his summiteering. Now, many questions continue to pop up in the course of these discussions, because as we had said in an earlier episode last week, this is the time when foreign affairs, strategic policy, the state of the world, this is the flavor of the fortnight, right? And we had said that we'll do couple or maybe more than a couple talking about these issues, some of the issues central to what's happening in the world. So today also I'm looking at a bunch of issues that are central to the state of the world right now, tell you the facts, give you my analysis and a little bit of opinion as well. So first of all, what is this biggest overhang, the most visible overhang under which this visit is taking place, and the most visible and the most dominating overhang under which these policy shifts are taking place, policy shifts, this really special and very fast, extraordinary pace of the warming up between India and the US, the sale of engines that might have been restricted so far, top of the line drones with the top of the line technology and sensors inside them. It's not the platform, it's what's inside the platform. It's not the body, it's the brain of the body and what's inside the brain of the body. Now there, the opening up of the Americans is all owed, a lot of it is owed to one factor, and that is called the China factor. So that is the overhang. The overhang is China. Everybody is concerned about this not peaceful, not non-threatening rise of China under Xi Jinping. He's changed the picture, and that's how everybody is modifying their policy. Now, two things arise from this. One, this has pushed many countries closer to the other side, to the Western side. I keep using that expression. A lot of the world is Chin Pidit, right? So they are now coalescing on the Western side because that is the side that balances China. Because so far you had a unipolar world. Now you have 1.5 pole. America, China, the second pole. The important thing is that America is there, and America's Western alliances are there. And I will talk about that in a minute. But at the same time, China is now rising. So China, I might have said just now, it's a 1.5 pole world. It's not a unipolar world anymore, but it's not a multipolar world either. China is the rising pole, half as yet, but rising. And that's why this is influencing everybody's policy, including America's and India's, and especially their policy towards each other. Now, that said, you might have also seen some concern expressed that, while this is happening, Biden administration is also reaching out to China. So, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was in China. He had a very long meeting with Wang Yi, who's among the senior most people in the CCP establishment. He was also given an audience with Xi Jinping, which is rare for a cabinet officer. So, what are the Americans doing? He also made a statement at the end of his visit, towards the end of the business end of his visit, saying that America did not believe in Taiwanese independence. So in a way, he's been accused of giving the game away because Joe Biden had said earlier that America will come to Taiwan's defense if it comes under attack from China. Now that is something which America is bound to do by its own law, not by a treaty, but by its own law. At the same time, this was seen as a case of Biden administration reaching out to China At the same time that it's warming up like this, it's embracing India so tightly, mainly driven by the motivation that there is a Chinese threat, there is a rising Chinese threat. So what does it tell us? What it tells us is that China has now become much too powerful for any country to want to decouple with. So what does it tell us? It tells us about how much China's power has risen. So that which takes us to our next point. So everybody is concerned about supply chain diversification. People think that too many of their supply chains are in China. Anytime CCP, Chinese Communist Party, particularly under a leader like Xi Jinping, can tighten this, or China can be unstable, some things can happen there. So nobody wants to pull out of China, or not to pull out completely, but people want to hedge their bets. So they want to do some friendshoring, some offshoring, some nearshoring. So shift some of these bets here and there. So it's one thing to want to diversify your supply chains, but nobody, and that's where opinion comes in, but we call it opinion or analysis. No power in the world today wants to decouple from China. That includes America and all its Western allies. In fact, so dependent is the world now, in this globalized world, on China and Chinese supply chains and Chinese cheap goods. And cheap goods are not just bangles and Diwali ka patakas, Panchmi ka kites and things like that, or chappals. What the Chinese produce very cheaply is laptops, is mobile phones. It is generators or turbines for our power plants, heavy machinery. The Chinese produce those at the cheapest and the most competitive prices in the world. In fact, and once again, I'm straying into the territory of opinion, even if India has a very successful Make in India program for 20 years, for 2 decades, India will still not be in a position to decouple from China. India will diversify a bit. India will start making many things in India, but then the Chinese meanwhile will start making many more things so cheaply that India will be importing from them. That's why, while in India we fret over the fact that we have such a negative trade balance with China, at the same time we are not going to put shutters down on this, because if we pull shutters down on this, a lot of the Indian businesses and industry will cease to be competitive because they need these cheaper Chinese inputs, cheaper Chinese machinery, cheaper Chinese electronics. So that is the power of China. Again, European countries and America, if they were to decouple from China, inflation in their countries will go out of the roof. Already they are suffering under inflation, but even that will completely go out of control. Even their effort to keep it at least below the double-digit mark, that will go out of control if they stop importing cheap goods from China, because Chinese sell the cheapest goods in the world and Americans, the Europeans cannot do without those. And that's why you find that leaders of France, leaders of Germany landing up in China and saying things that make headlines in different ways. And I will come to that in just a second. Now, size of China. Once again, I don't want to scare ourselves. Sometimes Steve Cohen used to tell us, Professor Steve Cohen, who taught us all strategic studies, particularly about the subcontinental issues, he used to say that sometimes nations make their threat perceptions by looking at the mirror, like a man who looks at the mirror, makes faces at himself and then gets scared by what he sees in the mirror, right? His own face, but because he's making faces. So I don't want to do that, but I just want to give us a fact check, because there is a lot of breathless celebration, for example, of the fact that Air India ordered 470 aircraft with Airbus and Boeing. Now, look at this. Now, Indigo has ordered 500 planes. Look at India's soft power. Fantastic. Who can compete with this soft power? Now, this is great. This is soft power. 470 and 500, and there are some also on order by SpiceJet, now Akasa Air as well. So that's why CAPA, the Center for Asia Pacific Aviation, they estimate that at this point about 1100 civilian aircraft are on order by Indian aviation companies. This is a big deal in today's global economics. But see it in perspective. Put this in perspective. Look at the size of China. Look at what the Chinese are doing with their civil aviation. I'm just using this as an example for a reality check. India has a total, according to DGCA's website, 698 civil aircraft. 698 civil passenger aircraft. 1100 are on order, right? Those are the ones I counted just now with Indigo and Air India. So only 698 right now. If you go to other sources, Statista, other public sources, then let's say 700, round figure. But DGCA tells you 698 right now. How many does China have? Would you like to know? India has 700. China at this point has 6,795 aircraft. That is almost exactly 10 times of what we have with our civil aviation companies. 10 times. In fact, China is currently holding 2,100 Boeing aircraft. That is three times of the total number of civilian aircraft in India. And if you think as a consolation, dil behlane ko ghalib ye khayal acha hai कि it's only Boeing, so maybe Boeing dominated the Chinese markets. How many Airbuses are the Chinese flying? That's also exactly 2,100. Again, the important part is that of these 2,100, 600 Airbuses, all single aisle, not wide-bodied, 600 Airbus aircraft have been manufactured in China at the Airbus plant at Tianjin. What that means is that 30% of all Airbus aircraft flying in Chinese skies are made in China. So that tells you how much bigger China is, and that gives you an idea of the scale as well. As I had said a little bit earlier, I'm not saying all this about China to scare ourselves, but it's important in strategic affairs to give ourselves a reality check, because when breathlessness of a celebration gets ahead of the facts and rhetoric gets ahead of rationalism, that is when strategic errors are made also in public opinion. So it's important to understand this. That's why I know a lot of people say, oh, everybody's in China's lab. France is in China's lab. Germany is in China's lab. Now the Americans also, they are trying to get into China's lab. The fact is, you can use a different expression. Sitting in somebody's lab is not a fair expression, because countries act in their national interest and they do what they think is good for their countries. That is not the issue, but every country in the world at this point is trying to find a modus vivendi with China, which is a way of working with China and which is a way of working with China that is rising, but not in a non-threatening manner. India is also doing exactly that. That's why India is very skillfully, and I would say very wisely, again opinion, very skillfully and very wisely managing its tensions with China. I see a lot of criticism of the Modi government. Why are they naming China? Now the Chinese have again done a terrible thing at the UN, protecting Sajid Mir, who is a convicted terrorist in Pakistan linked with 26/11, to try and protect him from being declared a global terrorist. The fact is, he's been convicted for terrorism by a Pakistani court, their own Iron Allies court, but still the Chinese have protected him. India has criticized China, but not by name. India has not named the country. Why? Not because India is scared, because everybody has to be realistic. People who make policy have their facts. People don't make policy on the street. And because people who make policy are smart people, they don't get influenced by slogans and celebration on the streets as they make policy. So they do what is correct and what is wise. Now, if this China, this risen China is a reality, the other reality, as Modi and Biden talk in Washington, is that the Western alliance is ironclad. It is very strong. So don't be misled by something that Macron said in China about Europe needing some autonomy. The French are always like that. The French always say something that makes headlines because the French must sound different. But remember, in almost every war that the Americans have gone out for, the French have been by their side. Fact is that they are the first allies of the Americans. And they were the first allies of the Americans even during their Revolutionary War. Korean War, the French were there fighting alongside the Americans. Later, in the first Gulf War that followed the occupation of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the French fought alongside the Americans. In fact, they sent a large task force of almost 20,000 people, and they also sent one of their aircraft carriers, Clemenceau. So that was there fighting alongside the Americans. In fact, of the European countries, if I can call Britain also European countries still, of the European countries, the only two countries whose troops fight at a frontal level as American allies and take casualties, unlike many of the other European countries which have a token presence in these operations because they must be seen to be allies. Britain and France actually get involved in combat and take casualties. So first Gulf War, the French were there with one of their aircraft carriers. In the Afghan War, the French rejected the American invasion of Iraq, saying that that's not correct. But in the Afghan War, they were very much a part of ISAF, that is the international force led by the Americans. And once again, in this case, they sent one of their aircraft carriers, that is Charles de Gaulle. So don't think that the French are now charting another path and they are breaking away. So the Western alliance is very much together. Everybody, as I said earlier, is trying to find a modus vivendi with China, but they are together. Look at the Americans. Americans today have military installations in 11 countries, US Air Force in 20 countries, US Navy in 16 countries, and US Marines in 3 countries. And at least in 3 countries, that is Germany, South Korea, and Japan, they have very large operational military bases and very large bodies of troops because they are treaty bound to defend them. All of that's not going to go away. So just as the rise of China is a reality, that's not going to go away and nobody is going to be able to undermine this, at least in the foreseeable future. The Western alliance is also going to be there. It's not going to go away. Now, what kind of changes can take place in this world if these two factors are given? And if these two factors are taken as given, what is Modi doing in Washington and what does he aim to achieve out of his talks with Joe Biden? So the only changes possible in the global balance of power today, in this global balance of power, are subtle changes. It's not possible to change anything radically. You can bring about subtle changes to suit your own interest, particularly if you are a geopolitical swing state. That's something we spoke about in Cut The Clutter a couple of days back, defining what a swing state is and how India belongs in that category and how India is probably the strongest swing state in the world right now. Not a global power, but the strongest swing state. The next important point is that we are not yet a multipolar world. A lot of people keep on saying, oh, now it's a multipolar world. Everybody on his own. It's not a multipolar world. As I said just a few minutes back, it's a 1.5 pole world, right? China will keep rising. West will keep stable and tight. India in this process will remain more inclined towards the West. And given the way the Chinese conduct is, particularly if the Chinese conduct stays the same way, India will become more and more inclined to the West. For the simple reason, besides other things, that nothing else is available. You cannot have an ekla chalo re situation in this global environment. Next point, look at Russia. Please note also the point that I've come this far into this episode of Cut The Clutter, almost into the 20th minute, without even mentioning Russia once. And that tells us a story. Russia is a country in decline right now. Right now, in a rapid and a steep decline, I would not say terminal decline, because Russia has many strengths. This war will end someday, one way or the other. Whichever way the war ends, Russia will have the ability to recover. But Russia will never go back to the kind of power it had before the war. Forget becoming a Soviet Union again. And as the war goes on, Russia will become more and more dependent on China by the day. West, in any case, is at war with Russia. Next point. India is navigating this very carefully, and I would again say quite skillfully and wisely. It's tightening the embrace with the US and the West. At the same time, it's trying to keep things calm with China. So all these calls, go chadhai kar do China ke upar, go take some territory in Ladakh, etc., give the Chinese a choice, right? Either escalate or exchange territories. All of that Indian government is not doing, which is a very smart thing to do. And at the same time, India is quite wisely keeping clear of the conflict in Ukraine, not taking sides there, because you know what? Times change. Times change and you don't know dramatically what will change when. What is the example of times changing? So I am specially picking up for you the example of the Middle East, particularly the Gulf countries. Until about 10-15 years back, the Gulf countries were seen to be much more inclined towards Pakistan. Of course, friends of America, much more inclined towards Pakistan, very hostile to Israel, right? If you had an Israeli visa on your passport, they would not let you enter their countries. That's the reason some of us who traveled to Israel in early days used to carry a paper visa. A visa was given on a separate sheet of paper, which after you finished your travel, you came back to your country and you folded it away. And if you went to a Middle Eastern country or an Islamic country, There was no evidence on your passport that you had been to Israel. 10 years back, that was the situation. And that's why the Gulf countries were very inclined towards Pakistan. See what's happening now. See the amount of bonhomie between the Gulf countries and India at this point. See also the amount of distance that has grown between the Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and UAE, and Pakistan now. Why has it happened? Because as I said, times change. So several factors have changed. Number one, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds have become really humongous, particularly as the price of oil has remained high and there have been many spikes of the kind that we've seen in the last couple of years. They need to invest that money somewhere. Second, India's economy, given 30 years of compounding or 40 years of compounding, because I would say India's growth started in Rajiv Gandhi years, right? That's what history tells us and that's what data tells us. In 40 years, the power of compounding has made India such a large economy that these countries with these humongous sovereign wealth funds have to invest in India. Where else will they go if they don't invest in India? At the same time, Pakistan's economy and Pakistan's stature has shrunk. In the past, they needed Pakistan militarily and politically because first of all, there was an emotional attachment to Pakistan being the second largest Sunni nation after Indonesia and also the country with the most modern and disciplined Muslim army capable of absorbing modern technology and also with battle experience, a battle-tested army. So the Gulf countries held the Pakistani armed forces in awe. And the fact is that several times when they had trouble, Pakistan's armed forces came to their aid. Pakistani armed forces, for example, helped the King of Jordan, King Hussein, in September 1970 in what was called the Black September crisis. That's when the Palestinians had revolted against King Hussein and a Pakistani army contingent, strong army contingent, was used to put down this rebellion. Who headed that contingent? It was a brigadier called Ziaul Haq, right? September 1970. And we all know what Ziaul Haq became in the course of time. In Saudi Arabia, for the longest time, Pakistani armed forces have maintained a presence in Pakistani uniforms of 20,000 plus because the Saudis have thought that after the siege of the Mecca, they needed a strong professional Islamic force to protect them. So they've been there. About 60 to 70,000 Pakistanis serve in the Saudi armed forces. I've shown this picture to you before, but when we went to cover the first Gulf War, after the liberation of Kuwait, we took a Saudi Air Force flight from Dhahran to Kuwait City. All of the crew on the flight were Pakistanis. And I've shared with you this picture of me and Prashant Panjiyar, our photographer, sitting in the back of that plane. So all of it changed. Times change. All of it changed with the change in India's stature economically, politically, militarily, and decline in Pakistan's. Again, very importantly, with the thaw between the Gulf countries and Israel, the signing of the Abraham Accords. Who could have imagined that while we had to carry paper visas if we went to Israel, so the Gulf countries will not get furious and turn us out and deport them on arrival if they saw an Israeli stamp on our passports, that now Air India planes can fly to Israel over Saudi Arabian territory. So these are the factors I thought I will mention to you. I'll list for you with facts, analysis, and opinion this time. Because that is the state of the world, or that is the state of play in the entire world as Narendra Modi and Joe Biden meet in Washington.